All right, so today I want to go over two things. One is the rendering of motion blur. So I'll cover that after I do the bouncing ball, and that'll just be included in the bouncing ball thing. You will use that on your stick too. Motion blur is very essential to make sure that your stuff looks like it's in motion. Sometimes something will be moving, but we don't get that motion blur, and so we kind of lose that. I'm going to start the bouncing ball one. That way, if you do get your stuff rendering, then you can start working on the bouncing ball while that's working. There's obviously plenty of computers here where if you needed to, you can open up another computer and start working on the bouncing ball. Or in Maya, you could actually just open up a new version just by doing that, like open Maya again, and then you'll have a new version of Maya that you could work on in the background, okay? So first things first, when we animate a bouncing ball, it obviously helps to have some sort of drawing or sketch or something to kind of go by of how it's going to be moving. It also helps to have some reference, right? And that's great for YouTube because there's like so much reference on YouTube for literally anything that we would want to see. Here's one this guy does where he actually has like a whole bunch of different kinds of balls bouncing, and that way you can get an idea of how each one of these things is going to interact differently with the ground and so on. Depending on what kind of material it's made out of, it may bounce higher or lower or whatever. Obviously, I think the first one was a bowling ball. Oh, dodgeball. Maybe the bowling ball's after. Okay, so it's good to have some reference. That way you can kind of go by it. As we're doing any kind of animation, think about we're animating something, so we want to exaggerate it. Just like we looked at those 12 principles of animation, we want to incorporate a lot of that still into this kind of animation, okay? So the first thing I need to do is make a project folder. So I go to project window, I make a new project, Sarcona bouncy ball. I put it my 2540 and I hit accept. And then I'm going to go to my front view and create my sphere. There we go. So I'm going to use a polygon sphere, not a NURB sphere. It doesn't matter where you start this as far as like going back or whatever. The biggest thing is to make sure you do it in stages. It's very easy to think you're just going to jump into it and animate the whole thing moving and rotating and doing all this stuff. It's very difficult, especially if you've never done it before, to do that. So I like to break it up into stages, make sure everything works correctly. So I'm going to first set this to translate y of 1. That way it is perfectly sitting on the ground. And then I'm going to freeze my transform so that it's zeroed out. And then I'm going to animate my translate y right in place. Make it look like it's bouncing first, and then I can start animating it moving, then I can animate it rotating, and then I can animate it squishing and squashing, okay? So it's like a progressive thing. That way I can focus on one step at a time without having to look at all the attributes at once. So first keyframe, I'm going to go right here. So it's going to go there. You won't know where to set your next keyframe, so just kind of start moving stuff around and then setting keys. This happened to be right at 0 when I did that. So I'm just basically going like every 10 frames and just positioning this. I'm just going to have to type 0 there. And then 50. And then 60. Cool. So now I rewind, I hit play. Wonderful. Okay. So that was a long way to do what I just did. Okay. Changing the values and then setting a key, and then changing the value, setting a key, changing the value, setting a key. So right away I want to start showing you the faster way to do things, because as you animate, the best thing to do is just start getting keyframes down so you can see the animation and then start tweaking it, okay? So I know that basically it's going to go from here is one key pose, and then it's going to be here's another key pose, and then that's just going to cycle over and over again, right? So if I just go to frame 1 and I set a key, and I go to frame 20 and set a key, then I go to 40 and I set a key, they're all at the ground. I'll even go to 80 and 100. Okay, so every 20 frames, it's still on the ground. That means that every in between frame, it's going to be in the air. Obviously, I'm going to run into an issue when I go from 1 to 10. That works perfectly, but when I go to set the next one at 30, it's on the ground again, right? So if I go to 10, and then instead of left clicking and dragging, I middle click and drag, or just middle click, the ball stays exactly where it's at. It doesn't update the time. So then I can set a key there, go to 50, set a key, go to 70, set a key, go to 90, set a key. And now I hit play, and it works. Okay? So middle mouse button will not update your time or your viewport. It'll just move the time along. Okay? Perfect. Hypnotic. All right. So does it look like it's bouncing? No. What's it doing? Right. It's moving up and down, and it's easing up to the top and then easing down to the bottom. Where should the easing happen? At the top, right? So let's go into the graph editor. Okay, so it's easing right at the top. Okay, at the bottom you said it shouldn't ease, so what should it do? Linear, right? Just straight up, like that. So now if we watch it, boom, boom, boom. All right, it's all right. I could probably stand to go into the dope sheet and maybe scale these together a little bit. The height of it is not matching the speed of it, okay? So if it goes too short and it takes like a really long time, I'm not going to get that same effect of bouncing. So I'm going to go to my scale tool, make sure I grabbed everything, and then middle, there we go, not middle, left click and drag on that handle. I'll bring that to about there. All right, I've gone too far. Let's go the other way. Only I have. Okay. All right, so it looks like it's doing okay. You'll notice that it looks like in some of these keys, it's actually not hitting the ground. Okay, so like right there, it looks like it's not hitting the ground. Even if I go up a frame or back a frame, it's never hitting the ground. As you use the dope sheet, it could move keyframes between frames. So like right here at 49, that keyframe is not at 49. If I click this red lined arrow, there it is, it's at 49.27. That's when it hits the ground. Okay, that's annoying. But if I go to the graph editor and I grab all my keys, I can say edit snap, and it'll snap the time so that they are right on solid keyframes. Okay, that's just a thing that it does. So now when I hit play, each frame is going to, or each time it hits the ground, it'll look like it's hitting the ground. Great. Okay. So that's great. I think I want to enhance this a little bit more. So we went over before how we can break the handlebars so that we can adjust them kind of manually, right? So I'm going to do that. Curves, weighted tangents, tangents, free tangent weight. Don't break these ones, or don't try to do anything like crazy with these. We want this to stay nice and smooth. At the bottom though, we have a little bit more freedom as to how those are going to go. Okay, so I'm going to again do it the easy way, maybe. No, I can't. I'm going to do it one at a time, I guess. I'm going to do this. I'll do this. Oops. All right, so for this one, I want to move just one handle. So I'm going to go up here to the break, and that breaks it, so then I can just move that. Same thing here, break it. Now you'll notice that I'm only pulling one side up. I want to give a little bit more stress to it as it comes up. It kind of like comes to rest a little bit more, like it's exaggerating it coming to rest at the top, and that's going to fly straight down, okay? And I'll do another little trick after too to emphasize that if this doesn't get as clean as I want it to. All right, so now I look. There you go. So now it looks like it's taking a little bit more time to get up there and resting and then slamming down. Cool. It's like the bass, right? All right, now one more thing I can do to make this a little bit more apparent is if I take all these keyframes here, and instead of them being evenly spaced, I'm going to take the end keyframe of it and push it more towards that side, okay? So this is the end of this bounce. This is the end of that bounce. This is the end of that bounce. So I'm going to take all of these and just scoot it over a little bit. So now this will really exaggerate that fall down, okay? That might have been too much. I moved it over only 2 frames, but that still might be too much. We'll find out. Right, it does. So that might be a little bit too aggressive. Let's go back 1 frame. And then I think here, I'm going to just even that out just a slight bit. It looks like it's kind of arcing back too, and I don't want it to arc back, like fold in on itself. There we go. There we go. That feels a little bit better. It could go maybe one more like back where it was. Oops, wrong spot. Graph editor. All right, let's see what it looked like before. Yeah, that actually works the way it was. All right, so sometimes you'll change stuff and it just doesn't work the way you want. No problem. Cool. So the first bounce, what caused it to bounce? Was it? Magic, right? That's all that's happening. This thing isn't alive. It's a ball. All of a sudden it starts shooting up, and then it does stuff, okay? So when we do our actual animation, we will have 2 seconds of it rolling. Some event will happen, and that will cause it to bounce. So in the past, students have given the ball like a face, and the ball is alive. So it rolls, it squashes down, and it leaps up. Okay, that's something it could do. Or there's a platform it hits, and that launches it into the air. For now, it's magic. But the magic is gone after the first launch, okay? Physics kicks in. So what do we know about physics if we are looking at the height of the first bounce? What about the height of the second bounce? Less, right? So we don't know how much less. Let's just say there. And then let's say there, and then let's say there, and then let's say here, okay? Now, all right, so if we know kind of ahead of time what the graph is going to look like, we should always adjust the heights and stuff before we start screwing with the handles, because that kind of thing happens, okay? So it's not a huge thing to fix. I just grab all the bottoms again, make them all linear, grab all the tops, and I can make them flat, which is what they were, okay? So I'm not going to adjust any handles yet because I still have more work to do. Let's take a look at this and see. We should get an about estimate of what it's going to do. Okay, so what's our next thing we have to fix?
You have to make the bounces closer together.
Right. So every bounce, it's going up less, so they should be taking less time, right? So right now they're all taking the exact same amount of time for this to happen. So my advice on how to fix that or how to make it look correct is if you looked at that first hill, the next hill should look like the same one, just smaller, and the next hill should look the same one, but smaller. If you look at the very last hill and the very first hill, they look completely different. One's wider than it is taller, and the first one is obviously taller, okay? So this one here, I'm just going to grab these 2 keyframes and scoot them over. I'm using the graph editor for this. It's just my preferred. You could definitely use the dope sheet for this if you would like. But I like to see the graph as I'm tweaking it. And this one needs to come over a whole lot. Here we go. So that might be close enough. We'll see. Closer, yeah. Cool. All right, so that's sufficient for what we're doing. You can tweak these things later. Cool. So now I would go back into this. Oops. And then I would grab the handles. And then I would tweak the handles again. And again, I may have to grab all these at the bottom because I already know it, break all the bottom handles, and then go through and tweak these. Now you may find that when you get to the very last one, it might only be 4 or 5 frames. So playing with that handlebar isn't going to do a whole lot, okay? Very little, okay, especially for how high it's going to go. But why not just do it so that way they're all even. And I still think that one should probably come over maybe another frame, which makes that even less, and you should probably come over another frame too. Okay. There we go. So now it's feeling, again, a little bit more like it is actually bouncing. Cool. So that's the bounce. So I get that situated. I don't notice how I started off with my keyframes all the way from 0 to 100. Had I gone through and set up my first keyframe for the position, the rotation, the scales, and all that, and then I went to 10 and did it, and then I went to 20, and then I went to 30, 40, 50, all the way to 100, and then I realized, holy cow, I have to adjust stuff. That's a lot of adjusting, okay? This way, the major thing is already done. We have our timing set up for this bounce. Now I can go ahead and do the rest of it. All right, so now I know, I'm going to rewind this a bit. I know that I want this to move, obviously, in some direction. Do not go on a diagonal. Keep it going straight in one direction. That will make your life a lot easier, okay? So I'm going to rewind it or move it back like this. Doesn't matter where I start it. It does matter how far it travels, though. So I'm going to go to Translate X. I'm at frame 1. I set a key. And then I'll go to, let's say, 95. I'll move this up. There we go. And set a key. So now we'll see how this looks. Okay. A good distance. Too far? Not far enough? Too far. That's what I think too. Also look at our graph. Our graph is easing at the beginning, easing at the end. We probably want it to ease at the end, but not at the beginning, okay? As the ball comes to rest, sure, it slows down. But at the beginning, he's just going. So let's move that. Let's scoot this, down. Maybe scoot this up. Let's see how that looks like. That seems a bit more appropriate. We could have a little bit less there and there. All right, sufficient. That one is one I can adjust later too. That's not a huge deal. Cool. All right, so now look at the amount of keyframes. This is Translate Y. Every time it's changing position, we have a keyframe. Translate X, 2 keyframes. That's it, okay? So another reason why we want to break these into pieces is because some will have more keyframes, some will have less keyframes, okay? So now that that is good, now I can do my rotates. So if I was just rotating it, let's say it's a bowling ball, there's no squash and stretch on it. I'm going to go to my rotate Z, I'm going to set a key here, I'll go to the end of this, and I will crank it up like a whole lot. Sure, there we go. I'll go to my graph editor, and I should have probably about the same kind of motion. The beginning of this would probably be linear, the end of it would probably be flat like that, so it eases out. So let's rewind it and see. All right. So it's very difficult to see the ball bouncing and rolling. So for something like this, you may need to go kind of not frame by frame, but clicking and dragging to see what it's going to do. Okay, so that looks like it's doing, that's pretty good there. Now I want to watch it roll. So I'm going to, I don't want it selected. I'm going to turn on my wireframe, then click off, and then hit play. Okay, so as I watch it roll, what should happen is as the ball is rolling, each part of it is making contact with the ground. Okay, just like a tire. It wouldn't like be spinning like this as it's moving very slowly, or moving very slowly while it's just like flying along. So that's stuff you have to look out for. If I go to the graph editor and really exaggerate it further, you'll see exactly what I mean. Maybe, we'll find out. There you go. Right. So it's going actually so fast it's going backwards. Oops, wrong one. Graph editor. There we go. All right, so that was fine there. Now, like I said, because we are doing squashing and stretching on this, we want to set it up correctly so that it squashes and stretches appropriately. So I closed my window, dang it. Bouncy ball. There we go. Okay, so we know that right here, when the ball is hitting the ground after a bounce, right, it's squashed down, and then the frames before it and the frames after it, it's going to be stretched out, okay? So that's what we want to do. So if I go to where the ball is hitting the ground right here, and I go to squash it, I squash it down like this. Notice how it's no longer hitting the ground, it's like floating. That's no big deal. We'll just move it back down. Now, when we did our, my side view, nope, front view. When we did our box animation, we talked about, moving the pivot. If we move the pivot, then what's going to happen is every time the ball squashes and then it goes to the next one, well, now the pivot's going to be on the other side. Okay, so we're just going to keep the pivot right in the center. That way we don't have to worry about adjusting it. Okay, we are also, oops, let's put that back. We are also going to make sure that the ball doesn't do a full rotation from one spot to the next. Okay, so as the ball is coming down here, there it's basically flopped over, and then when it gets to the next one, it's flopped over again. Then when it gets to the next one, it's flopped over again. It will not do like a full rotation in the air. Okay, so I want to make sure that from one bounce to the next bounce that it doesn't rotate that much. That's too much for it to bounce. So I'm going to set this to negative 180 degrees and then set a key. And you'll see specifically why when we actually view it. So I'm going to squash it like this and move it down. Now what they say about the video about squashing and stretching? Right, the volume the same, right? That's what he used. So we can't just like do this, we have to do this and scale it outward, okay? Like that, right? Now, just so you're aware of it, if I go to perspective view, I didn't scale it both directions. I should scale it both directions out like this, okay? That's what these little things are for, so you can scale it in two directions. So I'm going to go to my front view. That looks good there. I'm going to set a keyframe for my Translate Y and my scales. Okay. Now I know when I get to the next bounce, it should be the same thing, right? When it hits the ground again. So I'm just going to go to my next bounce. I'm going to adjust my rotate. So now we're at negative 360. I'm going to move this down. And then I'll set another key for all the things I just changed. Okay, and then I'll go to the next one. I'll subtract another. This is why we have to rotate it 180 degrees each time. Otherwise, we'll end up with stuff like this. The next one will be negative 540. I'm just subtracting 180 each time it hits the ground. I'll move it back down. And then I will keyframe all of these things. Okay. So now if we rewind this and play it, oops. The very first keyframe is not flat. There we go. So we hit play. Okay. Now, after it does the third bounce, typically there's not really enough momentum for it to be like squashing and stretching like really a whole lot. So typically after it's done the third one, so 1, 2, 3. After this, I'm basically going to let it go back to being a sphere. Okay. So by the time we get to about here, these will all be back to 1. And then we'll be back to where we were. All right. So every time it hits the ground, it's squashed. When it leaves the ground, so maybe like a frame later, it's going to be the opposite. So it's going to be stretched out like this. And it's going to be squished in like this. I'm not too worried about the Translate Y. I think it should be good. So I'll just set a key there for those, and then I can preview it. There we go. All right. So then right before it hits the ground again, right here, it should be stretched out. So if I know that at frame 16, it should have that same value. If I just middle click on, oops, come on. If I just middle click right here at frame 16 and then key that, then it'll update that value. Okay, so I can use that middle click trick over and over again. So I'll key that. I middle click here, basically right before it does any bounces. And then right after the bounce. So right before the bounce, right here, and then right after the bounce. Good. Okay, so there's my bounces right here. Okay, so what about when it hits the top of the arc? What should it look like? Normal, right? It should just be back to its normal shape because there's nothing affecting it. It's kind of evened out. When it's at the bottom, the ground has squashed it down. When it's leaving the ground, it's stretching out because of momentum. At the top, it's just back to normal. So reset these to 1, set a key on that, and then each one of these single keys, I'm just going to middle click and set a key. So now if we rewind this and play it, we get this. There we go. So now we have squashing and stretching. It rotates. I do need to adjust some stuff in the graph editor. So one of the things I need to do is delete this. This is just random stuff that got keyed on accident. On my rotate, if I watch how this curve is going, okay, and I kind of follow that line, that's where it should end up, okay? So just to exaggerate it, it shouldn't be like this because that line is flowing basically like straight. It should end up like about there, okay? That way the rotation is still in line with how the ball is moving. How about my scales? How are these? Confusing looking, right? So if we keep in mind what's happening here, we have this scale X and Z are always together because they're going to control the ball going in and out. The scale Y is going to control the ball up and down. So scale Z and X are together, scale Y is by itself. They're also going to work opposite. So as Y goes in, X and Z are going to go out. As Y goes out, X and Z are going to go in, okay? So if we know that, then this here, and I'll zoom in so you can see it better. This here is where the ball is squished. That's where the ball is stretched. This is where the ball is normal. This is where it's stretched. This is where it's squished. This is where it's normal. This is where, sorry, stretched again. This is where it's normal. So stretched, squished, stretched, normal. So we get this pattern over and over again. So what should happen in this case is as the ball's bounciness is going up and down, right, it's going less bounce each time, what should happen to the stretching? Right, should go down. Now, going down is going to be different than you may think. So it's not going to be like moving the whole thing down because we're dealing with scale. Right here is normal. That line right in the middle there. So it's actually going to converge. So those two graphs should kind of come together near the end. So if we ignore everything as far as what we're seeing here and just look at how far apart these are from that center line right there and just gradually move those closer, then we'll be in good shape, okay? So I'm going to go to these and leave them fine. Those are good. I'm going to go to the next ones. And I'm just going to hold shift and middle drag this in a bit. Middle drag this in a bit. Take this, middle drag it in a bit. Middle drag this in a bit. Same thing here. And this one here is the stretching coming in. Obviously the stretching going out is going to be less, right? So the same thing here. I'm just going to scoot this down so it's less there. Scoot this down so it's less there. That's less. This is less. Okay. That very last one, you'll see, is not going to have a whole lot on it. I want to have some, but I don't need a whole lot. And I'm just basically using the lines that are here, like where this one's at, for where this one should fall. And this one we can pretty much put it like right there. Cool. All right, so now let's take a look. There you go. Now it feels a bit more realistic because it's squashing and stretching, more appropriate with how it's bouncing. So everything else look good? How does my translate Y look? You can't see it, it's happening so fast. Okay, I adjusted how much it's squashing and stretching, so my translate Y's are probably off. Okay, so I need to go to where they're hitting the ground, there, and just verify that it is hitting the ground correctly. This one, holy cow, it's like in the ground. I probably moved that one too far down, so let's fix that. Let's go to the next one. Nope, that's in the ground too, so we'll just move that up. And we'll go to the next one. Move that up. And that should be it. That should be right in the ground. Perfect. A bounce, right? So pretty simple to do, just a bounce. Now, what happens if I wanted to add 2 seconds of rolling at the start of this? Do I delete all my keys and start over?
Dope frames, the dope sheet, just
Move it down, right. So dope sheet, grab all my keyframes. How far am I moving it down?
how many seconds did you say? 2, so about 60 or more.
Yep, 60 or more. There we go. Okay, so that way I know I have 2 seconds of rolling here. That has to happen. Some event will cause it to start bouncing. And then at the very end of this, after all my bouncing is done, then I will have 2 seconds or more of just rolling. Okay? Now when you do your bounces, you should have 3 major bounces. Boing, boing, boing. And then you should have a couple of trickling bounces that are just there to kind of even it out. If you just have 3 and nothing else happens, like right, where is it? 1, 2, 3. Okay. So if I were to go and delete the keyframes from this area here, besides obviously it floating, it just looks like a weird transition. Okay? It just floats down, right? Even if we didn't have that, it would look weird for this ball to have so much momentum for these first 3 bounces and then just stop and roll. So that's why you need those trickling ones at the end, so it gradually comes to rest. You might have 5 trickling ones or 3 or 2 or whatever. A lot of it depends on how high up you went and how fast you move the ball. Keep in mind what it's going to look like when it renders. If I went up too high with the ball, like this is a good amount. If I went up that high, my camera has to be really far back in order for me to even see the ball bouncing that high, right, for it to make sense. So when it's like this, it's easy. Okay. So when I do my rolling, I would just go back to the beginning of this, reset these to 1, make sure the ball is on the ground. And then go backwards, and then rotate it backwards. So now it's going to roll. And you can come up with whatever it is you want for that ball to do whatever at the end. Or at the end, at the beginning of how it's launching. Like I said, yeah. You can also have obstacles, like some people put like fences or rings or something there so it jumps through those things. Whatever you build, make sure it doesn't compete with the attention of the ball, right? So the main focus here is the ball. That should be the main focus. It shouldn't be like 15 other things in there. So those are some examples. So when you create your lighting, nice lighting for the scene, same thing with the ground. Make sure there's a big enough ground. Don't put anything in here like that fits exact, because if you make a ground and you're like, all right, it's going to be just this. right? Unless you're doing something like Rob had where he had the bridge, that makes sense. If you're not doing something like that, make it huge. That way it doesn't feel like we're in a CG world. All right, so I'm going to add a material to this. Same materials that we did last time or before. We're going to use that AI standard surface. And then if we just pick a color here, we won't see it move, okay? Regardless of what color we pick, we won't see it move or rotate. You click on this map button, and then you can find one of these items. Now there's a couple that I'm going to recommend. One of them would be file. So if you found a picture of something that you want to put on the ball, that would be where you would drop it in. Just so you can see, I'll click file, I'll click folder, and then I will go find a quick image that I have already in my folders. 25, 10, Candyland, textures, graham cracker, there we go. Any textures I have, I'm going to put inside of my source images because when I go to Maya, that's where it's looking. So graham cracker, I hit 6 so I can see it, and there's my graham cracker. And I'll turn my wireframe off. And now as it rotates, you can see that it's rotating. And as it squashes, oops, you can see how it squashes and all that. Glorious. All right, so if you wanted to do graham cracker, that's how you do it. I would also recommend, if you wanted just something simple, a ramp is a good way to use it. Okay, don't grab just any one if you're not comfortable with it. File is a good one because you can grab a picture and just drop it on. Ramp is another good one because if I hit 6, you can see where I'm able to take this and then just give it like 2 colors. There's red. I'll drag this over, drag this over. It's pretty close to the middle. There we go. Right, it's a Pokeball or a red pill, a red and white pill. Right, and you can still see it rotate. You could even add an extra color in here. Where'd he go? Lost him. So I'm going to click sphere, hit F. There we go. I'm going to turn my interpolation to none. That way it'll make a solid line there. There you go. So white, red, white gives me this stripe down the middle. Again, just something kind of cool versus just being a plain sphere. And then obviously we'll be able to see it rotating and moving and whatever else. Awesome. That's that part. And then for your render settings, this is the other part. So as we start animating stuff or rendering stuff out from now on, we want to include motion blur. The first one we didn't because of how it was rigged. It would basically get to a certain frame and just stop working, okay? So with this, it's just a piece of geometry, so it'll work. So in your render settings, that little gear, in the Arnold renderer, eventually we'll crank these up, but I'm going to go down to my motion blur and I will turn this on. I also need an environment. So I'll make a sky dome light. I will also make a area light. And I'm just going to crank this area light up so it's obviously there. And then I will render through Arnold. Crazy bright. Let me take this down a bit. So 200,000. There we go. Let me take my sky dome down a bit. There we go. So now I can see it much better than I could before. Good. Okay, so here it is without motion blur. The ball will basically be crystal clear, right? There's no edge blurring at all. Once motion blur is kicked on, then we'll start to see more of that motion coming from the ball kind of trailing behind it. So you'll especially see it like around the edges, and then as you see those texture bits, you'll see it there. There's a couple things that we can look at. So one of them is keys. Whenever it does motion blur, it's sampling different frames, okay? So if we said that there's 2 keys, there's basically going to be like 1 frame here and 1 frame there, and that's how it's doing the keys between them. If we wanted more of that arc, sometimes if you have a keyframe here and a keyframe there, or a frame here and frame there, if it's supposed to go in an arc, it may miss the arc, okay? So if you see, and it's not going to do it here because it's a pretty simple scene, but you still should know about it in case you hit that point. Come on. Okay, so here it is at the top of the arc. If I see that maybe it's not blurring in a arc form and I want it to blur in an arc form because that's the motion of my item, I could increase the amount of keys on this, and that will make sure that it sampled enough keys inside there to make sure that it's nice and smooth, okay? It's kind of like if my arm is here 1 frame and then over here the next, it might draw a straight line when really I did like an arc to get there, okay? So you would typically want to add more keys for that. For this, you should be fine with 2. There's also a position as to where the motion blur is happening. Right now it's on the center of the frame. I typically like to put it at the end of the frame because that way the front of this will be clearer than the back of it, okay? That way that item is, like I said, more in focus at the end of it, kind of going towards than the other way. You could also increase the length if maybe you wanted the blur to happen a little bit further and be a little bit more stretched out. For this one, you're probably not going to notice a huge difference, but just be aware that those options are there. There's also a camera blur. As my camera is moving and let's say following this, it would blur everything too. You basically, or for this, you probably don't want that. So I'm going to turn off camera blur. If I turn off deformation blur, some of the deformers that are there won't blur, okay? So in this case, everything's going to blur with this one off too, so it's fine. And then that's it. Those are the options. So you basically just need to enable it, turn these 2 off, set this to end of frame. If it doesn't look right, then you can play with the keys or the length, okay? Not too much, but just something to be aware of. So now I would go in here and I would set these to higher values. 3, there we go. And then I would go back to my comment tab. I would set my stuff up. Sarcona, ball, bounce. Name.number.extension. Set this to be however many frames I have. It's not that many. Make sure I pick my camera. I didn't add any camera to this one, but obviously you'd want a camera just like we did before. New camera. The blue circle, where's the ball? Find a good camera angle for this. Don't try to make a anything crazy. Okay, you may have to follow the ball a little bit. Or you might be able to find a good angle where the ball's in it the entire time. Like that angle right there is pretty good. Oops, it goes out of frame a little bit. I don't want that to happen, so I'm just going to adjust back in the frame. Perfect. Okay, so 180 is actually my end frame. And my camera is not loading, so let's close that. Let's reopen that. There it is. I'll rename it render camera so I remember it. Cool. So now I would just go into texturing the ground, fixing my lights, blah, 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 and then going to my render sequence, making sure I pick the correct camera, and then saying go. Once it renders, the process is the same, okay? For all of our assignments, the animation stuff will be new, but all of this stuff will be the same. How we render stuff out and texture it and light it, the same thing we did in the first one is the same thing we're going to do on every other one, okay? The only difference in this one I'm showing is obviously making sure we have a file on that, and then making sure that we have motion blur checked on. Questions? Cool.